Welcome to this evening's program, which is from a local group called Yes on Four. And the purpose is to answer any remaining questions about ballot question four. And with us tonight, we have three community members, two of whom are Kay Rand and John Nicholson, and the third, Val Peacock, who is also the chairman of the Bar Harbor Town Council. Kay and John are members of Yes on Four, co-chairs, as I understand it. Val is not affiliated with Yes on Four, but she's got a deep knowledge of the subject, so we're glad to have her with us, as well as the other two. We're going to begin with just a 2-minute bio statement from each of the panelists, just to give you a sense of who they are and what their interest in this issue is. And we'll start with John.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Nicholson. So I was born and raised in Bar Harbor, one of the few that is. Actually, it goes back to my great-grandparents, I believe, and I would have to ask Jill's husband, how far back it goes and do some genealogy there. But I've worked at First National Bank for over 27 years, involved in a lot of extracurricular activities outside my job, including president of the Keble Valley Golf Club, treasurer of Acadian Youth Sports, treasurer of Village Improvement Association, and the MDI Hospital and a corporator for the hospital. And what drew me to this committee and why I'm passionate about this proposal by the town council is that I'm really worried about those organizations I just listed and other nonprofits that may lose some funding by the business community if their revenue drops. I have other reasons why I'm passionate, and I agreed to co-chair this with Kay, which I'm sure we'll talk about later. But I certainly appreciate the opportunity to be part of this town forum.
Thank you, John. Kay, what's your backstory?
My name is Kay Rand. I've been a resident of Bar Harbor almost 10 years to the day, and have been involved in public policy all of my life in some fashion or other. For the first 6 years that I lived here, I commuted to Washington, D.C. every week to serve as chief of staff for Senator Angus King. But I started my career as a lobbyist for the Maine Municipal Association, where I learned the role of local government in our intergovernmental system and developed a lot of respect for it. But I also served at the state level as chief of staff to Governor Angus King. And I've also served in the private sector as a consultant. So I have a lot of experience in public policy. But most importantly, I'm glad that my foundation was started at the local level.
Thank you, Kay. And last but not least is Val.
Yeah, I'm Val Peacock. As Jill said, I'm currently the chair of the Bar Harbor Town Council, but I'm originally from New Hampshire. I moved here in 1994 to go to College of the Atlantic. I went for a year and didn't end up finishing school at COA, but I ended up staying in Bar Harbor. And I got involved with the fishing industry. I worked on some lobster boats and did some scallop diving. I was also the assistant harbor master in Bar Harbor, but way back with Eddie, when Eddie was the harbor master. And then I ended up served through lots of different ways, ended up coming into a career in education. So I went to the University of Maine and got my teaching degree, and I taught secondary science at Sumner Memorial High School over in Sullivan. That led to an alternative program, which led to me starting a nonprofit or co-founding a nonprofit. So my actual job is in education. I have a nonprofit called Rural Aspirations Project. We work all over the state in little rural schools, looking at the connection between what's happening in the curriculum in schools and to the future and current vitality of those communities. So working to make things that are place-based and project-based and getting students connected to their community. So get to help see kids being part of solution work and connecting them into, local municipal government, which is interesting to have that connection between town council and my work. And then I also, I'm starting my 5th year on council, I think. So, so I'll end it there.
Does it feel like less years or more years?
No, I think that's it. I said 4 the other day, but I think this is my 5th. And I've been on the harbor committee I was on the Ferry Terminal Advisory Committee before I was on the council. And then I lived in Lemoyne for a few years, and I was on the school board there. So I've been involved in different municipal, places of government. So yeah.
All right, thank you. Next, we're going to spend just a few minutes, like not quite 10, with each of you talking a bit about why you see this as an important vote and what you think are the desired outcomes from the article on the warrant on election day. So anybody anxious to start us off on that?
I can go, Jill.
Great.
So I had a few, and I can circle back and just do one at a time here. But I do support the town council's attempt at a balanced solution because I feel like for a couple reasons off the bat. One is I think it gives the community time to really cool down. This has been a divisive issue all around us on both sides, friends and family. And I feel like this gives us time to just take a breather, get this passed, and it gives us time to really have both sides come to the table and look for more sustainable solutions in the future. This gives us some stability here for a few years. Certainly, the solution's not perfect. There's both sides to the issue. They're very passionate about both sides. This is very out of the ordinary for me to get involved in something like this. I really like to drive down the middle lane. But I do feel like this is something that's tearing our town apart. And if we can just buy ourselves some time, come to the table, come up with what bothers the most about both sides of the issue, and maybe come up with a longer term plan. But I do give Val a ton of credit in the council for coming up with this proposal in front of us, and I do support that. So basically, just take a breather, buy some time, and go from there.
Good. Thank you, John. How about Kay?
As I said earlier, my public policy experiences at all levels of government, and I have worked for a governor and senator and represented local officials. And I have to say that the toughest job is serving at the local level. Your kids go to school together. You sit in the same pew at church. You see each other at the grocery store. There's no insulation from the tough decisions you have to make as a local town councilor. So I felt very strongly that the hard work that the council had put into this measure deserved support. And I felt pretty strongly about that. I think they've created a fairly elegant solution. It forces compromise. It forces collaboration. It forces collaboration. The cruise ship industry has to work with the council. The council has to work with the cruise ship industry, and the council has to work with the voters of Bar Harbor. So it's the council could have done nothing. They could have continued defending the ordinance that's on the books. But they took it upon themselves to try to reduce the amount of legal expenses and to create a better way to manage cruise ships at the local level rather than through the court system. So I applaud what they did. I think it creates an opportunity to move forward in a more sustainable way. We can't have this debate every year. We've got to do it. We've got to respect the will of the voters and manage cruise ships. We can't just go back to the way we were 5 years ago. But I think what they've put forward is a balanced and hopefully sustainable way to do that.
Thank you, Ken. Before I go to Val, some people are having trouble getting in and are being asked for a password. It is 710258. The passcode 710258. Let us know if that doesn't work and we'll see what we can figure out. All right, Val, your turn.
Yeah, I think just when I came onto council in 2020, and Jill was on the council back then, and we are hearing really loudly from the community that there was a real need to reduce or start to look at reduction of the cruise ship industry and visitation of the town of Bar Harbor. And, Jill and I, as part of the council at that time too, really hearing that, it was kind of the first time the council had been in a place where we had a majority of people who might be willing to vote for that. And we started looking around and thinking about how to actually do that. We commissioned a survey, and then we started working in the space and realizing, one big realization that I had was that there wasn't really any policy. There weren't really, it was mostly just through agreement, through working together, through just, year after year scheduling things and working through things. And so when it came time to thinking about how do we limit, what are we actually talking about, and we realized there wasn't really any process or policy there in that space. And so the council was trying to figure that out. And I think we were struggling with that. And there was a lot of complexity in that space. When the land use ordinance came into play and through the petition process, I think at that point people were frustrated and, were looking for change and frustrated not seeing that change happening at the pace they wanted or to the extent they wanted. So it went through, and the council immediately started to think, okay, what does this mean? And, pretty quickly we were served with, we were asked to, the petition, the ordinance was challenged in federal court by Apple. And so, the first thing we had to do was figure out how to defend it. And so as we started to do that, we also were looking at how to implement it, what the rules were making, what it meant to actually do this, to actually implement this approach. The land use ordinance is a different approach than the way the council had been doing, or the town had been managing cruise ships. And then, land use is a really different way. It wasn't the way that we were thinking about. So, we went through that trial and we won, and we came out of that. And in that process of learning and understanding what the policy was and what it needed to be, what was missing, we were also getting lots of input and feedback from legal and from other players that there were some more challenges coming to this. Our win was already being appealed. We were getting some signals from the dock owners that they weren't going to just apply for the permit and just play ball with us. They were, signaling that they had a pre-existing non-conforming use in the space. And so, the council was seeing all the issues with both implementation and all the challenges that were coming. And we made a motion to direct the town manager to come up with an alternative for us that created significant reduction in cruise ship and visitation, as well as created an off-ramp or an end to the litigation problems that we were seeing. And that hopefully could bring us together and bring some trust in the council. So, when we did that, we weren't fully sure what that meant. And our team of the town manager and our legal team really leaned into the space and started investigating that and coming up with ideas and building that out. And I think what we have in front of us is an alternative to the land use ordinance that does do those things that we asked for it to do. And in order for that to be enacted, which the council has already passed this ordinance, but in order for it to be enacted, we need to repeal the land use ordinance, and that's the vote in front of us in November. So the council is basically asking the community to think about what is the best policy approach and that's going to get us the results we want in terms of having control and reduce visitation, as well as ending some of the challenges that we've been having with the land use ordinance implementation.
All righty, thank you so much. For anyone who is tuned in and has a question for the panel, it goes into the Q&A thingy on the bottom of your screen, not the chat thing. We're not monitoring the chat for the public. We're monitoring that Q&A. And I will be asking any questions that come in through there. And I'm going to start us off with a question that gets at what I understand to be kind of the heart of this whole issue is visitation by cruise ships. Do we want more of it, less of it, or the same amount? So can you compare the overall visitation between our existing plan and this proposed plan? Because there are a lot of people saying, well, we voted for 1,000 and now you're talking 3,200. But I understand that it's a distribution issue. It's 3,200 passengers at a time on some days, but none on other days. So can you help us understand the distinction between visitation under the current plan and under the proposed plan? And I'm looking at Val.
Okay, so the land use ordinance that we have in front, that's the law of the land at the moment. It limits disembarkation of passengers to 1,000 per day. So that's the number of people that can step onto the dock off of a cruise ship, and we're not counting the crew, it's just the passengers here at 1,000. So that's the limit or the level of visitation that we're looking for with the land use ordinance. Anything above that would be a violation and would be, pursued that way. So the Chapter 50, the new ordinance, which requires the cruise lines to have a license and use a reservation system to come here, inside of that license, which is memorialized into a contract, there's a cap system in there that has different layers of cap. So in the current land use ordinance, there's no season. So they could come any time of the year, any day of the year. And we know there's a natural restriction that cruise ships are not coming here in January, or it would be pretty interesting to see try to come here in January. So we know they're not coming year round. And typically cruise ships come, sort of have come sort of mid-April-ish to mid-November, and those shoulder season visitations tend to get canceled. But the new proposal does actually stop that. So it starts it allows it to start in the last week of April, and then it stops after the first week of November. So we do have an actual seasonal visitation that says that ships cannot come at any time outside of that. And then we also added in, so we have a daily cap, like we used to have before the land use ordinance, is how we used to talk about things. And that's a 3,200 per day based on the lower berth capacity. So 3,200 passengers would be booked through the lower berth capacity of the ships. So
say what that is, please, Val.
Right, so that's not the actual number of people that come off the dock. It's actually a standardized number on the ship that kind of gives you a sense of how many people are on the ship. It's the best approximation that we have based on the lower berth capacity. So it's like a double occupancy of a hotel, like of how many people would be in the sort of regular, the berths that are on the ground in a ship, I guess, on the floor.
So there may be some more people than that, but not many.
You could have more people than that, yes, and you could have less people than that. So if the ship isn't fully booked, there could be less people, and there can be more people than that as well.
Okay.
So yeah, it's not exactly the number of people coming ashore. And just to be clear, before the land use ordinance, this was the way that we actually did reservations. So we've been using lower berth capacity for about 30 years in the town of Bar Harbor before the land use ordinance. So it's a standardized measure of a ship that gives you the best approximation of how many passengers, but we wouldn't be counting passengers in the same way we would with land use ordinance approach. So we have 3,200 passengers based on the lower berth capacity per day. But then on top of that, we've also layered in monthly caps. So the monthly caps and the daily caps work together. So if there's 3,200 passengers per day, but in the months of May, June, July, in August, there's only 20,000 passengers per month that can come. So you have a 3,200 daily cap. And once you get to book ships in those days, once you get to 20,000, you're done. So even if there's extra days and there's days without ships and places, they would stop. So that when we looked at sort of historic visitation and the size of ships we're talking about and who would be around, you're looking at probably about an average of 10 days with ships in those months. So because of that 20,000 passenger, but it's not guaranteed. And if the ships are smaller, you could have more days. But once you hit 20,000 passengers booked, we would stop taking reservations for those months. And then in September and October, we give
I'm going to make sure I understand this, because this is something I wasn't familiar with. You're saying that the likelihood is that there would be 10 ship days in those months, and the rest of the days we'd have no ships at all.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
For the smaller ships, the US flagships that are 200 passengers or less don't apply into these caps. So you could have those ships coming in, but I think, with the types of ships that are in circulation and the way that they visit during those months, again, it could be more days than that. But again, once you hit 20,000, if you have 3,200 a day, if you just divide that out, right, 20,000 divided by 3,200, it's less than 10, right? So we were sort of giving you that there's going to be some days that aren't 3,200. There might be a 2,500 passenger or 2,000 passenger ship or something. And so you could have more days.
Right.
And then September and October are at 55,000 in that month. So those are where the peak of visitation does come. Like, and when we were hearing all of this in 2020 and seeing what 2019 was and what 2022 was, having 3 ships a day, 5,500 passengers a day, day after day after day with no gaps. 55,000 definitely brings it down from what it was in those peak times. And then also we have contracted in those days 10 guaranteed free ship free days in each of those months. So those days were actually listed within the ordinance and agreed to, and those days will not have ships. So it'll be 10 days in each of those months without ships. So the rest of that month of 55,000 would be scheduled at 3,200 passengers per day. And that's sort of a Jenga puzzle, how you do that. It's a first come, first serve reservation system. So, you know, Chris, the harbor master, will take the reservations as they come and assign them in. And if there's still capacity in a day, he would book a ship, but if there wasn't, he wouldn't. So the chances of meeting every one of those days, meeting 3,200 and having that perfect organization of how many ships can fill that space are pretty low. So you're probably going to see, we'll never, I don't want to say never, but it'll be pretty hard to actually reach 55,000 in those months because of those days and the way that we schedule in.
One of the challenges of any complex issue is that legislative bodies tend to develop a shorthand language of their own. And Val, I heard you use the term Chapter 50. Chapter of what? What is Chapter 50? And why is it a better approach than the land use ordinance for this issue?
Well, I'll tell you what Chapter 50 is, and then we'll see if anyone else has any thoughts about why it's a better approach too. So I'm not the only one that might be able to answer that, but Chapter 50 is, so right now, the land use ordinance that was passed by the voters in 2022 is in the land use, and that is in Chapter 125 of the town code. So it's that's where that is living, and that's what we're asking folks to repeal. Chapter 125-77H is where this current management system is. The new proposal that we're asking the town to replace 125 with, which is part of the question. So the question is asking if you want to repeal and replace it with Chapter 50. This is a council initiated ordinance. So it's outside of the land use ordinance, but it's still in our code, and it's in Chapter 50 of our code. And that is an ordinance that requires a ship to have a license to visit the town of Bar Harbor, and it requires a ship to use the reservation system that is that we'll set up, that we've been using before, that we would continue to use now to reserve to manage the caps. And inside of that, those licenses would be turned into contracts. So when we talk about contracts, what we're talking about is each cruise line would, to get a license, would have to sign the contract with the town. Inside that contract are all the caps and the ways for changing those caps into the future. And then also there's a release of claims in there for each cruise line to sign, saying that this is a lawful way, that they're agreeing that this is a lawful way to manage cruise ships into the future.
Okay, before I give Val and John an opportunity, there is a question from a viewer related to Chapter 50. And the question is, why does Chapter 50 treat small U.S. flag ships, that would be American cruise lines, as I understand it, differently than foreign flag ships? Does that difference expose the town to more litigation?
I don't think the litigation question, that's not anything that we were concerned about different litigation. So this was all part of the conversation that we had with the cruise lines as we were looking at the caps of this, and we did negotiate with the cruise lines and the cap for the caps. And then why is it different? Well, the ships are just different. U.S. flag ships are different. They don't need pilots. They're smaller. They are the size ships that we want to come here, that we want to prioritize in the town of Bar Harbor. They have a pretty limited impact in terms of, most of those ships are, we say less than 200 passengers, but the ships that come are 100 passengers. So it's a pretty small ship in that space. And when they do come, even though they're such a small ship, and even though they're exempt from the daily caps, they do still take up a space. So there could still only be 2 other ships in that day. But it was part of the conversation that we've been having with the cruise lines around how to accommodate and best, not accommodate, but how to best have visitation happening in Bar Harbor.
All right. Kay or John, anything to add so far? Kay, your sound is off.
I assured myself I wouldn't do that to you guys. Sorry. There's a couple of reasons why I think that Chapter 50 is the better alternative to the current land use. Val talked about the current land use embodied in the land use portion of our ordinances, and the enforcement isn't because it's a land use ordinance. The enforcement is through the court, the council, and whereas in the new ordinance, the council can issue citations and fines as an enforcement mechanism. It's much more efficient and less costly and better way to manage the issue, I think. But I want to talk about the importance of increasing the daily caps. I've spent most of my adulthood living in other parts of Maine. I've never lived in a community that depended as much as Bar Harbor does on the business of community support, the nonprofit assets that we all rely on year round. I personally am going to the business community often to raise money for the Mount Desert Nursing Association and other organizations. The cap as it is at 1,000 is going to endanger some of those businesses. And, these aren't big businesses. These are our neighbors. These are our friends who operate these restaurants and gift shops. They've invested. And I think it's in our best interest to make sure that we have a thriving business community. We depend on them. We're an island. We depend on each other, especially those of us who live here year round. The business community funds the Jessup, the hospital expansion, and soon we'll be making contributions to the school. So I think it's in all of our best interests to make sure that our tourism-based economy can thrive. And I think the 3,200 is a balanced way to approach that issue. It's not going back to the way that it was. It is going to be managed, and it may not be perfect. And after we've lived with it for 5 years, we can change it. We could even change it sooner than that by a vote of the public. But I think it's worth supporting for that reason as well.
Good. I had a question, I think, related somewhat to this. I'm sorry that I can't see it at the moment, but I think it talked about the challenges of having to go to court for every violation of the current ordinance. But at the same time, the council or people who are in favor of this article are saying that ships aren't going to come anymore. So what about that dichotomy between it's a big process we have to go through to pursue violations of our current ordinance, and yet at the same time, we don't think any ships are going to come under that ordinance. Can anyone comment on that?
Well, I can just talk a little bit about the land use ordinance because the management of cruise ship visitation is within the land use ordinance. That comes with a certain set of how you enforce land use ordinances or enforce in a specific way, different than other laws or ordinances. And there's a process for doing that. It's the same thing that we use for building permit violations or any sort of code violations that are happening in the town of Bar Harbor. So in order, the way that it works is that the town or somehow we need to count the number of passengers coming off of a ship. And once the 1,000 passenger mark has been met, if any passengers over 1,000 come off the dock, we would just let them. We're not stopping them from coming on the dock. We're just counting them and documenting that violation, and then bringing the code enforcement officer. There's a process for notifying that there was a violation, a notice of violation, and there's a process for remedy. And then if the remedy cannot be reached in that through just with the code enforcement officer, that can be referred to council. And then council can either enter into a consent agreement or send that direct the town attorney to start procedures to bring that violation to court. And then it's resolved in court. There's a range of fines that are associated with that. That would be up to the judge about how those fines would be assigned. So that's one piece. And then that's part of the sort of implementation challenges that we've been facing in terms of thinking about how to enforce or how to actually make sure that we're getting what we want in this system. And then the other question, the flip side of this about if no ships are going to come, that has to do, so when you talk about 1,000 passenger limit, so 1,000 passengers can come off a dock, and we're not really sure what's going to happen with this, but we do know that the practice right now is that ships don't normally, a ship of 4,000 passengers doesn't normally only allow 1,000 passengers to come off in a certain place. That's not their practice. They, sometimes not everyone comes off a ship, but they can if they want to. So we've been told, it's been our understanding that the bigger ships wouldn't come necessarily, although we don't really know that. They could come and they could figure out how to do that. So that's one thing. But if you thought, well, a ship probably over 1,000 passengers wouldn't come if they couldn't let everyone off, then you're looking at the ships that visit in this region, the inventory of ships, and the ships that have developed a market in this place. And so if you look at the ships that have historically come that are under 1,000 passengers, there just really isn't a lot of those ships. That's not the market that's being developed or has been developed. And they don't visit in the same way that the ships come now. A lot of the ships that we have now come up from Boston or New York and go to Canada, and then they come back and they go back and forth, and we sort of see them on the way back on both ways. A lot of the smaller ships sort of visit in different routes and might come once or twice this summer, but not necessarily, every week. And then also the small ships, those 100 passenger ships do come more often, but there's only have a few passengers on them, so they don't really add up very quickly. So the question, and you've heard this out there and we don't really know, is that, will more smaller ships move into the market? Would we build that up? We're not really sure about that. And so, but if you look at historical practices and the number of ships that are in the area and how much of them come, it's definitely we're not going to see 1,000 passengers every day just because we don't have that number of ships and that number of frequency that they come.
Okay. Here's a question that is a good one. It talked about the Chapter 50 contracts. It says, did the town get a waiver from litigation for all cruise lines? If one of the big lines, and they give an example of a line, wanted to come without a contract and a waiver, could they? Is there anything stopping a cruise line from suing the town if they're stopped from coming? You have your law degree yet, Val?
Yeah. Okay. So the council has passed this ordinance. Chapter 50 ordinance has been passed. It was a vote of 6-1, and it's contingent on the land use ordinance being repealed. Before the council wanted to pass that, we wanted to have cruise lines sign these contracts to show that they would do that, to show that there is good faith in that space. And all of the cruise lines, so CLIA was part of that with us.
And who's CLIA?
That's the Cruise Line International Association. So cruise lines are actually competitors with each other. So there's quite a lot of rules around how competitors can work together or negotiate together to limit a market. So when we're actually reducing here, we're limiting a market, and that affects consumers. So there's rules around that. So we talked with CLIA, the trade association, is a way so that we could do this work, so that we could get a sense of what the members of CLIA were comfortable with or willing to work with us on as a way to do that. So when we asked for those lines, the cruise lines, to sign the contracts. So those contracts were signed by all the cruise lines that intend to visit the town of Bar Harbor, the ones that have come year after year. There's some that used to come that don't come anymore, that were saying that they weren't going to come or weren't planning to come. And inside of those contracts, there is a release of claims explicitly spelled out, saying that the cruise lines are agreeing that this is a lawful way to manage visitation in the town of Bar Harbor. So those are already signed. So remember I told you that the ordinance is a law. It's an ordinance that creates a law that says you have to have a license to visit the town of Bar Harbor to disembark passengers, and you have to use the reservation system. So if a ship without a license or contract came to the town of Bar Harbor, we have a law saying that you have to have a license. So we would pursue that violation through the pathways that we have. But I will just say that it's not to that it's very much disincentivized. This is process that we have. This ordinance is incentivizing the cruise lines to work with us and to do this. So if one cruise line without a contract that came to the town of Bar Harbor while all the other ones were, that there's going to be a lot of problems between the cruise lines as well, right? The pressure that folks that are playing aren't going to be happy about that. So I don't really see that happening. But if we did that, we would have that process of enforcing the ordinance that we would go through, and we would have to follow that through in court.
Okay. There are some questions about the process, starting with the initiation of this new system and then how it works. And people are asking questions like, does that happen every year, or why can't we vote on it every year? Or, so I understand it happens on kind of after initiation. It happens on a rolling annual basis that the town must approve any changes the council proposes to this plan. It is nothing that the council controls and can act on single-handedly. Is that correct?
Yeah, so the council definitely heard a lot of we heard this over and over again about the through the land use ordinance process that citizens have the opportunity to vote on these things, that this is not just the town council enabled to enact things, that the folks of the town have to vote all together to decide on things. So as we were building the ordinance, that was something that we were thinking about, that this is a council ordinance, but that it was really important that we were hearing that importance that the citizens wanted to be part of any changes. And really the parts that it seems like the town really cares the most about being involved in is the parts around the numbers, around the caps. And so we built into the ordinance and into the contracts that are signed by the cruise lines that any changes in after so the initial term of the contract is 5 years. After year 2, a 90-day window opens up in which the council could say that we want to change the caps than any of the numbers. So the caps include the months, the monthly caps, the days off, the daily caps, the seasonality, all of those pieces. If we wanted to change any of those things, we would propose that signal that we're going to change those. And then any change up or down or more or less would have to go to a ballot vote of the community and be affirmed by that. So the council can propose changes, but the council cannot enact changes to the caps. So in that 2 years, so the initial term is 5 years. After 2 years, each year we have an opportunity to signal that we want to make a change. And those changes would apply to the year after. They're 3 years out. So it would be on the initial 5 year, the first set of changes that would happen would be on the 6th year. But any change the year after that would go to the 7th year or the 8th year. So they roll out ahead of 1 year at a time.
Give everybody some notice that something's going to change.
So it gives everybody notice. It gives 3 years notice of a change, which includes the town, the town itself to get ready for that. Our budget is tied to cruise ship visitation. So being able to have that down ramp in that space or up ramp, depending on what's being proposed, it gives the business community time to change. And it also gives the cruise lines time to adjust as well.
Mm-hmm. Any comments from?
Yeah,
any of that? I know a lot of this stuff is technical and that's not necessarily where your focus is, but I don't want to leave you out of the conversation.
Yeah, Jill, I appreciate Val's technical expertise here.
Really, no kidding.
And she'll do most of the talking tonight, I'm sure. But, she said something at the end that I think is important and where I'm, stuck on is the stability. aspect of this ordinance. So it gives the business community at least an avenue to know what's happening for a few years. And then, as Val explained, there's a rolling process here. So you do have time to prepare for any changes that may come down the pike. But the stability part is important. You used to think the unthinkable couldn't happen. Well, now in this political world, the thinkable happens. Could the national park close in the middle of the summer? I would have said 10 years ago, that's not possible. Now it's happened here and there, thankfully, in the shoulder season and in the winter. But, that has a great impact on businesses. A rainy summer has a great impact on businesses. And they signed up for this. There are ups and downs every year. But if you've got those cruise ships coming in, regardless if the park's closed or if it's a rainy day, they provide a steady stream of revenue for folks. And the cost of business is going up. It's trying to get staff, trying to buy things, as everyone knows, going to a store. Well, they do it in bulk. So it's not easy to do business these days compared to 4, 5, 10 years ago. You add the added loss of revenue there, or the uncertainty of what's coming through the door. I think there's a lot of stress there. And I think this ordinance does give a little bit more consistency toward the business community with respect to that.
Yeah, some of the changes proposed all the time are big-ish changes, and it requires an adjustment period for residents, for visitors. And I think as we're trying to lift our sights, as I hear it in the discussion, to all of our tourism-related issues, not just those by ships. And that's going to open up a whole nother series of conversations, I'm sure.
Val, Jill, I might add that it's important to me and important to point out that the voters are still in charge of this process. We elect the council, and the council can't make changes without affirmation by referendum. I understand the frustration that some have that for 5 years, we're not going to be able to sign our name to a petition to force a referendum vote, but I'm okay with that. I think the representative form of government works best when ordinances are created and vetted through the legislative body. And I think it'd be good to have stability for 5 years and to get 5 years worth of experience and data before we change the system again. Making policy by referendum every year isn't the best form of government, in my opinion.
Okay, another question. Is it, and I think this is slightly different than town consent. This says, is it true that if Article 4 is voted in, passenger caps cannot be changed without written agreement of the cruise line?
No, so the cruise lines don't. So we did work with the cruise lines to set the initial caps because we needed the cruise lines to be part of the to be willing to sign the contracts and the release of claims. And so this initial contract was negotiated with the cruise lines. However, moving forward in the contracts that they signed, we no longer need to negotiate with them or have any agreement with them. It would be nice if we did, because I think collaboration is a better way to do things. However, it's really up to the town. So after the changing the caps, the way that it's set out right now is that the town council needs to signal that we want to change those caps. They need to propose those caps, and they need to go to town meeting. If we propose caps that the cruise lines don't like, that are too low for them or don't work for them, essentially, if that gets ratified through on the ballot vote, then they have a choice about whether they want to still visit here or not, whether they want to continue to have a license with us or sign a contract with us or not. And so that there's no more having to have an agreement about the caps. It's really up to the town. The agreement would be with the community, not with the cruise lines.
Good point. Thank you. Just anyone who is in the audience, if you have a question, you've been thinking about it, please do put it in the Q&A. We're getting through most of the questions here. We still have plenty of time left, so don't hesitate to put your question in. One other one that I have is this correct? Under the current proposal, ships of any size can come into the harbor and anchor, but only 1,000 people total can come ashore. Under the proposal, ships of more than 3,200 people can't even come into the harbor. Is that correct?
Correct.
Good.
So the one of the challenges of implementing the land use ordinance approach is that managing the ocean side of these things is different than managing the land side. So it's a land use ordinance. We're managing visitation by a dock, how many people step onto a dock, but that land use ordinance doesn't stretch into the harbor or into the maritime world of which ships can come here and which ships can set anchors here. So in order for the way that Chapter 50 is working, because it's an agreement, because the ships are signing a contract, a license, getting a license with us, they're agreeing to this approach. They're allowing us to step into that space to manage the anchorage side of it in terms of having a reservation to come. But even in that system, the town doesn't have the ability to stop a ship from coming in or setting an anchor. But in this is in the but they are saying we do have the ability to say that a cruise ship coming in needs to have a reservation in the space. So that is but in so I'm sort of losing my train of thought. In the land use ordinance, it is all about disembarkation, and the town we don't have a way to manage the size of the ships coming in. We do have a certain number of anchorages, so that does limit it, but not the size.
Okay.
In Chapter 50, we have the ships are agreeing to use a reservation system that is within this, and it's an agreement. They're agreeing to do that.
Mhm. All right. Another question. If the town lowers the caps and the cruise ships don't agree with that new limit, then there's no contract with that line after 5 years. But doesn't that leave us in the same position that we're in now, where the cruise lines could sue the town? That's their question, not mine.
Yeah. So there's nothing that you could do that's going to stop people from suing, right? People sue, or organizations or corporations sue. But I would say that this approach that we're putting forward, the Chapter 50 approach, is designed to be collaborative. It incentivizes the cruise lines to work in the system, to follow the rules, to be part of this. And if they do, if let's say in 2 years, the town decides to propose a change that's much lower than this, and they get to the end of 5 years, and that's a change for them, and they choose to challenge that, that could happen. There's nothing in here that says they can't do it, but they did sign a contract agreeing to this approach. And so that litigation space is a little bit different, because now we're in a contract litigation space with a signed agreement. The cruise lines will have operated in that system for a while and participated in it. So, I think I think that if that happens, I would be surprised if it happens, and I'm not naive around that it could happen. But I think we would be in a strong position because they have signed those contracts to be part of the system.
Mhm. Any other comments from Val or John? You're good?
You mean K, Jill?
Yes, of course I do. Are we good? We've gone through the questions that have come in from the Q&A, and I've had the opportunity to ask you a few things that I was a bit puzzled about. Is there anything left here, or is this, we're good? The one thing I would like to say is, if you haven't been there, and probably most people who are watching tonight probably have been, is the town website. If you put in Town of Bar Harbor cruise ships, you get a ton of recordings of meetings and reports and all that. There's a particularly helpful document. It's an FAQ document that summarizes a lot of the main points that people are raising. So if you're still looking for information, the town website is a good place to go, particularly that frequently asked questions document, which is just a page, very concise and very readable, as opposed to trying to wade sometimes through a town ordinance is not so easy. Anything else from anybody?
Thank you.
Yeah, no, and I just want to reiterate that, I was invited here to answer questions about the technical piece of this. I think the levels of visitation and how you feel about this, your opinion about this is it's up to everyone to sort of think about that, what this looks like, and not just the levels of visitation, but the policy approach and the way that we're asking the town to think about this. So, I thank you for inviting me and asking me to be here to field these questions, and I hope that I was able to give that light. But I just want to, the opinions that people have about this are their own, and I respect that too.
Well, thank you to Kay Rand, John Nicholson, and Val Peacock. It obviously shows the amount of time from her life Val has put into this and her deep expertise in the whole thing. But I'm also pleased to see two community members who just feel strongly enough to want to get involved. And that's one of the joys of local government. And to sincerely thank the three of you, all the other people who have put time into this on both sides of the question. The people who are poking at this and asking questions about what about this and what about that are as valuable to this conversation as its supporters. So thanks to all of you who have raised your voices and expressed an opinion. And I'm just checking this one last question about, I think we kind of covered that in terms of lawsuits. So I'm going to say that we're good to go with what I've had in so far. And again, thank you to the people who helped us get it organized, and to my Sherpa who helped me figure out how to get on this and stay on it in the evening. And we'll be interested to hear as this evolves further in the next very short period of time. But I'm sure that there will be a continuing conversation right up into the day we walk into the town office and cast our ballots. So thank you all, and good
Thank
night.
you, Jill. Thank you.
Jill, thank you.
Absolutely.